The Ardennes Forest in December of 1944 was not a place of peace. It was a white hell. The snow fell relentlessly, covering the frozen bodies of American and German soldiers alike, hiding the landmines and the craters in a blanket of deceptive purity. This was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate last gamble to split the Allied lines. Artillery shells shattered the tops of the pine trees, sending razor-sharp splinters raining down on the men huddled in foxholes below. Temperatures dropped to 0, freezing the oil and rifle actions and turning feet black with frostbite. But deep within the Hürtgen Forest, near the German-Belgian border, there was a small hunting cabin that stood alone in the storm. Inside, the air did not smell of cordite and death. It smelled of roasting chicken and potatoes. It was Christmas Eve. Inside the cabin were 2 civilians, a 12-year-old boy named Fritz Vincken and his mother, Elisabeth. They had fled the bombing raids of Aachen to find safety in these woods, hoping the war would pass them by. But the war was all around them. The sound of distant thunder was constant, the heavy thud of howitzers pounding the earth miles away. Elisabeth Vincken was a woman of strong faith and even stronger will. On this holy night, she was determined to create a sanctuary for her son. She had managed to save a rooster, naming him Hermann after Hermann Göring, perhaps with a touch of dark humor, intending to fatten him up for weeks. Now, Hermann was roasting in the oven, his fat sizzling in the pan, promising a feast that seemed impossible in the middle of a famine and a war. Fritz set the table with their best linens. The candles flickered, casting warm shadows against the log walls. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. They were just a mother and son waiting for Christmas. But then, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was urgent, desperate, a heavy thumping of a fist against the wood. Elisabeth froze. Fritz looked at his mother, his eyes wide. In these woods, a knock at the door could mean the Gestapo. It could mean looting soldiers. Or it could mean news of his father, who was serving in the civil defense. Elisabeth wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door. She blew out the candles to hide their numbers. She unlatched the heavy wooden door and pushed it open, bracing herself against the swirling snow and wind. Standing there, like ghosts emerging from the blizzard, were 3 men. They were armed, but they didn't look like conquerors. They looked like frozen corpses that had refused to fall. They wore American uniforms. The fear that gripped Elisabeth was immediate. These were the enemy. The propaganda had told her that Americans were gangsters, killers who would slaughter civilians without mercy. But she didn't see killers. She saw 3 boys shivering violently, their faces gray with exhaustion and cold. One of them was leaning heavily on the others, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. He was badly wounded. They stared at her, weapon barrels pointing down, their eyes pleading. They didn't speak German. One of the standing soldiers tried to speak in broken French. "Madame, please. Warm? Food." Elisabeth looked at the wounded man, who had collapsed into the snow, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The mother in her overtook the German citizen. She stepped back and motioned them inside. The soldiers stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, bringing the chill of the grave with them. They dragged their wounded comrade to the warm spot near the stove. Fritz watched from the corner, terrified, but fascinated. These were the Americans. They looked just like the young German boys who had marched off to war years ago. Elisabeth immediately took charge. She was no longer facing enemy combatants. She was facing freezing children. She ordered Fritz to get more wood. She tore strips from a clean sheet to bind the soldier's wound. His name was Harry, she learned.
The other two were Jim and Ralph. They had become separated from their unit in the chaotic forest fighting and had been wandering for 3 days without food, hiding from German patrols. As the warmth of the cabin began to thaw their frozen limbs, the tension slowly evaporated. The smell of the roasting rooster filled the small space, maddeningly delicious to starving men. Elisabeth checked the chicken. It was almost ready. She told Fritz to set 3 more places at the table. The Americans watched her, dazed. They had expected a firefight, or perhaps a cold cell. Instead, they were watching a German housewife prepare a Christmas dinner. Jim, the one who spoke a little French, tried to thank her, his voice cracking with emotion. Elisabeth waved him off, focused on the task. But the night was not over. The war had not finished with them yet.
Just as the potatoes were being mashed, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was sharp, authoritative. The Americans froze. Hands instinctually went to their carbines resting against the wall. Elisabeth held up a hand, signaling them to stay still. "Don't move," she whispered. She walked to the door again, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected perhaps more lost Americans. She opened the door. Standing in the snow were 4 soldiers, but the uniforms were not olive drab. They were field gray. The distinctive shape of the Stahlhelm helmets was unmistakable. These were Wehrmacht soldiers, Germans, her own people. But in this situation, they were the most dangerous guests imaginable. If they found the Americans inside, Elisabeth and Fritz would be shot as traitors for harboring the enemy. The cabin would become a slaughterhouse. The corporal at the front of the group saluted. "Fröhliche Weihnachten," he said. "Merry Christmas. We have lost our regiment. Can we rest here?" Elisabeth Vincken stood in the doorway, blocking their view inside. She was a small woman, but in that moment, she had to be a fortress. She knew that behind her, 3 American rifles were likely trained on the door. She knew that the 4 German Mauser rifles in front of her were loaded. One wrong word, one panic move, and the blood of 7 men and her son would stain the floorboards. She took a breath of the icy air and made a choice that would defy all military logic. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady. "You can come in and warm yourselves. We have some food, but we have other guests who you would not consider friends." The corporal frowned, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Who is inside?" he asked sharply. "Americans?" Elisabeth nodded. "There are 3 of them. They are lost, like you. They are hungry and cold, like you. And one is wounded." She stared into the corporal's eyes, channeling every ounce of maternal authority she possessed. "This is Christmas Eve, and there will be no shooting here." The silence that followed Elisabeth's demand was heavier than the snow piling up against the cabin walls. The German corporal stared at this small, fierce woman who dared to give orders to the Wehrmacht. Behind her, inside the warm room, the 3 Americans were clutching their weapons, fingers white on the triggers, ready to blast through the door the moment it opened. Outside, the 4 Germans had their fingers on the bolts of their Mausers. One twitch, one misunderstood movement, and the Christmas truce would end in a bloodbath before it even began. The wind howled through the trees, a lonely, mournful sound. The corporal looked at Elisabeth, then at the warm light spilling from the window, and finally at his freezing men. They were young, barely out of their teens, shivering uncontrollably. The war had hardened them, but the cold had humbled them. He slowly took his finger off the trigger. "Agreed," he said, his voice rough. "We will not shoot." Elisabeth nodded, but she wasn't finished. "If you want to come in," she said firmly, "you will leave your weapons here, outside." It was an insane request, A soldier never abandons his rifle, especially in enemy territory. The corporal hesitated, looking back at his squad. Then, slowly, methodically, he unslung his Kar 98 Chaos rifle. He leaned it against the rough log wall of the cabin. One by one, the other 3 Germans followed suit. They placed their rifles, their ammunition belts, and their grenades in a pile near the woodpile. They were now unarmed, stripping themselves of the only protection they had in the middle of a war zone. Elisabeth stepped back and opened the door wide. The 4 Germans stepped inside, stomping the snow off their boots. The moment they entered, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The 3 Americans were pressed against the far wall, their eyes wide with shock. They had their carbines raised, aiming directly at the chests of the new arrivals. The Germans froze, realizing just how close death was. The 2 groups stared at each other. Olive drab versus field gray, the uniforms of mortal enemies. The fire crackled in the stove, the only sound in a room paralyzed by fear. Elisabeth walked right into the middle of the line of fire. She turned to the Americans. "Put your guns away," she ordered. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute authority of a mother in her own kitchen. "It is Christmas Eve. There will be no killing in this house." The Americans hesitated. Giving up their guns to a room full of Germans seemed like suicide. But they looked at Elisabeth, then at the shivering Germans who were simply standing there, hands empty, looking at the roasting chicken with hungry eyes. Slowly, Jim lowered his carbine. He handed it to Elisabeth. The others followed. Elisabeth took the American weapons and carried them outside, placing them next to the German pile. When she returned and bolted the door, the cabin was sealed. 7 soldiers and 2 civilians were locked in a 12 by 12 room. The weapons were gone. The only thing left was the tension, thick enough to choke on. The Germans sat on the floor on one side of the room. The Americans sat on the bed on the other. No one spoke. The suspicion was palpable. Every glance was analyzed. Every movement was tracked. Fritz, the 12-year-old boy, watched from the corner, terrified that the truce would break. But then something shifted. The smell of the roasting rooster was overpowering. It was a primal, comforting scent that bypassed politics and ideology. The German corporal, whose name was Heinz, looked at the wounded American, Harry, who was groaning softly on the floor. Heinz saw the blood-soaked rags. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his medical pouch. The Americans tensed up as the German moved, but Heinz held up his hands to show he meant no harm. He crawled over to Harry. He spoke in broken English. "I am medical student. Before war, Heidelberg." He gestured to the leg. Elisabeth nodded encouragingly. The American soldiers watched in disbelief as the enemy soldier, the man they had been trained to kill, gently unwrapped the dirty bandages. Heinz examined the wound. "Not bad," he said. "Cold is good. Stops bleeding." He cleaned the wound with supplies from his own kit and rebandaged it expertly. When he finished, he looked up at the Americans and smiled weakly. That small act of kindness broke the dam. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed. It became curiosity. One of the other Germans, a boy no older than 17, pulled a bottle of red wine from his pack and placed it on the table. "For dinner," he mumbled. Another pulled out a loaf of dark rye bread, rock hard from the cold, but food nonetheless. Elisabeth took these offerings and added them to the feast. She ordered everyone to the table. There weren't enough chairs, so 2 of the Germans sat on the bed with the Americans. Fritz found himself sitting between a GI from New York and a Wehrmacht soldier from Bavaria. As Elisabeth began to serve the potatoes, the barriers of language began to crumble. Jim, who spoke a little German, acted as a translator. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about Hitler or Roosevelt. They talked about the cold. They talked about the food. One of the Germans saw a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in Ralph's pocket. His eyes lit up. Ralph hesitated, then tossed the pack across the table. The German caught it, took one, and passed it back. Soon smoke filled the room, mixing with the aroma of the chicken. They showed each other photos from their wallets. A girlfriend in Cologne, a mother in Detroit, a sister in Berlin. Elisabeth watched them. An hour ago, they would have butchered each other without hesitation. Now they were passing bread. She realized that without their uniforms, without their rifles, they were just boys. They were terrified, exhausted children who wanted to be home. The absurdity of the war was laid bare in that small cabin. Why were they fighting? Because they were told to. But here, in the warmth of the candlelight, the orders of generals miles away seemed irrelevant. Then came the moment for the main course. Elisabeth brought Hermann the rooster to the table. It was golden brown, glistening with fat. It was a meager bird for 9 people. But to these starving men, it looked like a royal feast. Before she cut it, Elisabeth stood up. The room went silent. The soldiers, some with cigarettes still burning, looked at her respectfully. "Tonight," she said softly, "we have a truce. But we must thank God for this food and for our lives." She began to pray. "Komm, Herr Jesus, sei unser Gast." Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest. As she prayed, Fritz saw tears running down the cheeks of the hardened German corporal. He saw the Americans bowing their heads, crossing themselves. In that flicker of candlelight, amidst the horror of the Battle of the Bulge, enemies wept together over a roasted bird. The dinner was not long, but it was joyous. They shared the wine. They laughed at each other's attempts to speak the other language. For a few hours, the war outside stopped, but the reality of the morning was looming. They all knew that when the sun came up, the truce would end. They would have to pick up their rifles. They would have to go back out into the snow. But for now, they were safe. After dinner, exhaustion overtook fear. The soldiers, American and German, sprawled out on the floor and the bed. Some slept shoulder to shoulder. The fire died down to embers. Elisabeth sat in her rocking chair, watching over her strange, impossible family, listening to the synchronized breathing of sleeping enemies. Christmas morning broke not with sunlight, but with a gray iron sky and the renewed thunder of artillery. The truce was over. Inside the cabin, the soldiers woke up one by one, groggy and stiff from sleeping on the hard wooden floor. For a few seconds, in that space between sleep and wakefulness, they forgot where they were. Then, eyes snapped open, meeting the eyes of the enemy sleeping inches away. The tension returned instantly, sharp and cold, like the morning air rushing in through the cracks in the logs. They scrambled to their feet, dusting off their uniforms, suddenly painfully aware of the insignia on their collars. The Americans moved to one side of the room, the Germans to the other. The invisible barrier that Elisabeth had broken down the night before was back up, rebuilt by the daylight and the reality of the war waiting outside the door. Elisabeth was already awake, stoking the fire. She knew the magic of Christmas Eve had passed, and now she had to manage a dangerous departure. She had taken the leftover bones of Hermann the rooster and the remaining potatoes to make a thin, hot soup. She served it in mugs. The men drank it quickly, standing up, their eyes darting towards the door. There was no more laughter, no more sharing of photos. The shared humanity of the night before felt like a fever dream. Now, they were just soldiers again, separated by ideology and fear. They were thinking about their rifles frozen in the snow outside. Whoever got to them first would hold the power of life and death. When the soup was finished, the moment everyone dreaded arrived. It was time to leave. The German corporal, Heinz, looked at Elisabeth and nodded a silent thank you. Then he looked at Jim, the leader of the American trio. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. It's time. Heinz walked to the door. Every muscle in the room was tense. He unbolted the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. A gust of freezing wind and snow blew in. Heinz stepped out into the blizzard. The Americans watched him go, their breathing shallow. Was he going to grab a rifle and turn on them? Was this a trap? Minutes passed. They felt like hours. Fritz watched from behind his mother's skirt. Then, Heinz stepped back inside. He was carrying the 3 American carbines. He walked over to Jim and held them out. But before he let go, he did something practical and profound. He ejected the magazines from the weapons and handed the empty rifles to the Americans, then gave them the loaded magazines separately. It was a gesture of trust, but filtered through military caution. "Go that way," Heinz said in his broken English, pointing out the door toward the west. "American lines, 2 kilometers, stay in woods, avoid roads." He was saving their lives. If they had gone the other way, they would have walked straight into the teeth of the German counteroffensive. Jim took his rifle. He looked at the German corporal. There were no words adequate for the situation. A thank you seemed absurd, given that they might be shooting at each other tomorrow. Instead, Jim extended his hand. Heinz hesitated for a second, then gripped the American's hand firmly. It was a handshake between enemies in the middle of the bloodiest battle of the Western Front. The other soldiers exchanged brief, awkward nods. The Americans shouldered their gear, helping the wounded Harry, and stepped out into the snow. They disappeared into the whiteout within seconds, swallowed by the forest. The Germans waited another 20 minutes to ensure they wouldn't cross paths. They gathered their own gear. The young German who had shared the wine looked at Elisabeth. "I wish this war was over," he whispered. Then they too were gone, heading east, back towards a collapsing front line. The cabin was suddenly empty, quiet, except for the crackling fire and the howling wind. Elisabeth and Fritz stood in the center of the room. The floor was dirty with melted snow and mud from 7 pairs of boots. The plates from the Christmas dinner were still on the table. It was as if a whirlwind had passed through their lives and vanished. Elisabeth sat down in her rocking chair, the adrenaline leaving her body, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She had done the impossible. She had stopped the war for one night in her own kitchen. But the war was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month. Thousands more died in those frozen woods. Elisabeth and Fritz survived the winter in the cabin, eventually returning to the ruins of Aachen when the fighting moved deeper into Germany. They never spoke much about that night. It felt too surreal, too dangerous to talk about in a country occupied by suspicion. Who would believe them? Who would believe that a German woman had cooked dinner for Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers at the same table? It remained a secret, a shining, bizarre memory locked away in their hearts. Decades passed. The world changed. Germany rebuilt. The Cold War froze Europe in a different way. Fritz grew up, moved to America, and started a business in Hawaii. He got married, had children. He tried to put the war behind him. But every Christmas, The memory of that night in the Ardennes cabin would return, vivid and insistent. He wondered about those 7 men. Did they survive the war? Did the wounded American, Harry, make it home? Did the German medical student, Heinz, ever become a doctor? The questions haunted him. In the 1990s, an older gray-haired Fritz Vincken decided he had to know. He began a search that would take years, trying to find ghosts from a snowstorm half a century ago. Fritz Vincken's search for the men from the cabin seemed impossible. It was the mid-1990s, 50 years after that snowy night. He had very little to go on. He didn't know their last names. He didn't know their unit numbers. All he had were the first names of the Americans, Jim, Ralph, and Harry, and the memory of the German corporal who wanted to be a doctor. He started by telling his story to anyone who would listen. He wrote to veterans organizations, military archives, and newspapers. Most of the time, he received polite letters saying they couldn't help without more information. The story was too fantastic, too movie-like to be taken seriously by historians focused on troop movements and casualty lists. It seemed the secret of the Ardennes cabin was destined to die with the people who were there. But in 1995, the television program Unsolved Mysteries heard about Fritz's story. They realized the power of the narrative, a Christmas miracle in the middle of hell. They agreed to air a segment reenacting the event, hoping that one of the soldiers, or perhaps their children, might be watching. The show aired, broadcasting the story of Elisabeth Vincken and her roasted rooster to millions of American living rooms. Fritz waited by the phone in Hawaii, hoping against hope. Days later, the phone rang. It was the chaplain of a veterans' home in Frederick, Maryland. He told Fritz that one of their residents, an old soldier suffering from heart problems and the early stages of dementia, had been watching the show. When he saw the reenactment of the German woman serving food in the cabin, he had become agitated. He kept pointing at the TV, saying, "That's me. That's me. I was there." The soldier's name was Ralph Blank. He had been a private in the 121st Infantry Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. He was one of the 3 lost Americans. Fritz flew to Maryland immediately. The meeting between the middle-aged German baker and the frail, elderly American veteran was overwhelming. When Ralph saw Fritz, the years melted away. He wept openly. "Your mother saved our lives," he kept repeating. He told Fritz that they had been certain they would freeze to death that night or be shot by patrols. Elisabeth's cabin was a miracle they had never forgotten. Ralph still had an old worn German compass that the young Wehrmacht soldier had given him that night in exchange for a cigarette. It was a tangible piece of proof, a physical link to the impossible truce. Through Ralph, Fritz was able to piece together more of the puzzle. He learned that Harry, the wounded soldier, had survived the war, but had passed away years earlier. Jim, their leader, had also died. Ralph was the last of the American trio. But what about the Germans? The search for them was even harder. The Iron Curtain and the chaos of post-war Germany made records difficult to find. Fritz focused on the one clue he had. The corporal was a medical student from Heidelberg. Fritz's story began to circulate in Germany. A newspaper in Aachen picked it up. A few weeks later, another call came. This time, it was from a man whose father had just died. Among his father's belongings, he had found a diary from the war. In it, the father described a bizarre Christmas Eve in 1944, where he and his squad had shared a roasted chicken with 3 Americans in a small hunting cabin, served by a courageous German woman. The father's name was Heinz. He had survived the war. He had returned to Heidelberg and finished his studies. He had become a doctor, just as he said he would. Fritz was devastated that he had missed meeting Heinz by only a few weeks. He met with Heinz's son, and together they read the diary entry. It confirmed everything. Heinz wrote about his fear when he entered the cabin, his respect for Elisabeth's immovable resolve, and the strange, profound peace of sharing bread with the enemy while the artillery pounded the hills around them. He wrote about dressing the American's wound and the handshake with Jim in the snow. For one night, Heinz wrote, we were human again. The reunion was bittersweet. Only Ralph and Fritz were left to meet in person. But the verification of the story changed everything. It was no longer a family legend or a desperate man's memory. It was historical fact. In 2002, shortly before Ralph passed away, the U.S. Army officially recognized Elisabeth Vincken for her act of humanity. A small ceremony was held, honoring the woman who, armed with nothing but a mother's authority and a roasted chicken, had disarmed 7 soldiers in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. Fritz spent the rest of his life sharing the story. He wrote a book, gave speeches, and ensured that his mother's legacy was not forgotten. He wanted the world to know that even in the darkest times, when hate seems to be the only currency, an individual choice for kindness can create a light that lasts for decades. The cabin in the woods is gone now, reclaimed by the forest. But the story remains a powerful testament to the fact that even in war, we always have a choice. We can choose the gun, or we can choose the dinner table. The story of the Christmas truce in the Ardennes is more than just a heartwarming anecdote from a brutal war. It is a microscopic view of the conflict itself, a moment where the massive grinding machinery of death was brought to a screeching halt by the simplest of human needs: warmth, food, and safety. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the enemy on the other side of the battlefield is not a faceless monster, but a human being who is just as cold, just as scared, and just as desperate to go home. In that small cabin, stripped of their weapons and their orders, the Americans and the Germans were no longer representatives of Roosevelt or Hitler. They were just Jim, Harry, Ralph, Heinz, and 3 other scared German boys. They were all sons, brothers, and perhaps fathers, caught in a storm, not of their own making. Elisabeth Vincken's role in this story cannot be overstated. In a world gone mad with violence, she refused to abandon her humanity. She was an ordinary woman who found herself in an extraordinary situation, and she met it with a courage that rivaled any soldier on the front lines. By treating these armed men as wayward children rather than mortal enemies, she broke the psychological conditioning of war. She didn't use force. She used food. She didn't use threats. She used faith. Her simple declaration that there will be no shooting here tonight was an act of defiance against the entire momentum of the Second World War. She carved out a sanctuary of peace in the middle of hell, proving that even an unarmed civilian can change the course of events through sheer moral force. The incident also highlights the strange, almost schizophrenic nature of warfare. These men were trained to kill each other on sight. A few hours before meeting in the cabin, they would have thrown grenades at each other without hesitation. A few hours after leaving, they might have done so again. Yet, in that liminal space of the cabin, they shared bread, wine, and stories. The German medical student dressed the American's wound. The American shared his cigarettes. The handshake in the snow between Jim and Heinz was a recognition of a shared ordeal that transcended their opposing uniforms. It was an acknowledgement that they were both victims of a larger, uncaring geopolitical game. Why does this story resonate so powerfully today? Perhaps because we live in a world that is still deeply divided, where demonizing the other is an easy political tool. The Ardennes Truce reminds us that the barriers between us are often constructed by others, and that they can be dismantled, even temporarily, by individual acts of kindness. It reminds us that compassion is not a weakness, but a strength. Elisabeth Vincken didn't survive that night because she was lucky. She survived because she was brave enough to be kind when everyone else was being cruel. The legacy of that Christmas Eve lived on in the men who were there. Ralph Blank kept the German compass for the rest of his life, a talisman of the night his enemy became his savior. Dr. Heinz went on to heal people, perhaps inspired by the night he chose to save a life instead of taking one. Fritz Vincken dedicated his later years to ensuring the story was told, a living testament to his mother's legacy. The story asks us a difficult question. If 7 armed soldiers in the middle of the bloodiest battle of World War II could find a way to share a meal in peace, what excuse do we have today for our own conflicts and hatreds? The Ardennes Forest has long since grown over the scars of the Battle of the Bulge. The foxholes are filled in, the shrapnel is buried under decades of pine needles, and the little hunting cabin is gone. But the spirit of what happened there remains. It is a beacon of hope in the dark history of human conflict. It is proof that even in the deepest winter of war, the human heart can still harbor the warmth of Christmas. If you believe that stories like Elisabeth Vincken's deserve to be remembered, and if you want to uncover more hidden history from the Second World War, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community of history enthusiasts.